I have two brief questions I'd like to ask, if I may.
Hi, welcome to Left Foot Media. My name is Brendan Malone and you're watching The Daily Question. Today's question of the day: why is the right to freedom of conscience so very, very important? Now, this issue is back in the news again because of the American cake baker who is being targeted again by their local state over their refusal to bake a wedding cake for a same-sex marriage. This is most commonly at the moment where this issue sort of plays out, but it's not just in that arena. It's also becoming more of a focus in the area of medicine, where you have doctors and health professionals who do not want to participate in the act of abortion, and so they politely decline and they will say to a patient, "I'm sorry, I do not refer for abortion, I do not carry out abortions, you'll have to go and seek someone else if you want to have an abortion." And so commonly these two arenas now are sort of these big, I don't like the term battleground, but these places where these issues are really sort of starting to come to the fore in a big way. A lot of people I know who talk very, very well about the right to freedom of speech often don't talk so clearly, concisely, or intelligently about the right to freedom of conscience. But the important thing is that these two rights are actually intimately connected to each other. When you talk about freedom of speech and freedom of expression, I think the pinnacle of the right to freedom of expression, the most beautiful and profoundly important expressions of that right are found when a person or persons speaks out against evil. And so something within them is made aware or is convicted of the fact that a certain act or action that's happening is not right, and they speak out against it. And that to me is the most profoundly important expression of the right to freedom of speech. And it's built on the right to freedom of conscience, because it's their conscience that has initially driven them to speak out, and it's that freedom of conscience that really underpins and fuels the speaking. So the speaking is actually giving voice to what their conscience is saying to them about this issue. So the two rights are intimately connected. But as I said, it's interesting to me how I will hear and see people who say really good and true things about the right to freedom of speech, who often are very muddy and confused about the right to freedom of conscience, and will even say things on that right that are just so completely contrary to what the truth is on this issue. There's a big mistake that often gets made by people when they think about the right to freedom of conscience. And interestingly enough, it's also a mistake that I'm starting to see some people make about the whole issue of freedom of speech as well. And that's this idea that the freedom of conscience is purely a private thing. So the freedom of conscience is your freedom to believe whatever you want to in your own head, basically, and then perhaps to get together with another group of people in private and to talk about, to discuss, like a church service or a club of some kind, where you meet in private with like-minded people and you agree on this particular moral question, but you're not allowed to actually then act on that idea or that thought that you have in your conscience. You are not allowed to act on that in the public square, that basically you should be servile in the public square and you should actually park your conscience and not. So for example, if you bake cakes or you're a wedding photographer and someone turns up to your place of business and says, "I want you to participate in my same-sex wedding," that you should park your conscience and you should actually be required to do what that other person wants you to do. Now, that is absolutely flawed. The whole point of human rights, as I said in a video last week, is they exist because of the fact that we live in community. The human experience has outlived in community. And in community, what happens is that you have human beings who often butt up against each other. And in that scenario, human rights are meant to serve as the sort of answer to the question, well, who gets the right of way in this scenario? When you've got two people with competing interests, who gets the right of way? Who has to give way in that scenario? Now, if our human rights are just nothing more that and these particular things are confined to the private sphere and nothing else, then it makes a mockery of that idea that human rights in actual fact are there because of the fact that we live out the human experience in community. But the whole point is that human rights prevent the strong from dominating the weak. The whole point of human rights is that they're built on this notion that every human being has a profound and equal worth and dignity, and therefore it's not okay simply for the strongest to dominate the weakest or the more vulnerable members of the community. That's not how we determine the answer to the question, well, who gets the right of way? This is where our human rights come to bear. So the idea that certain human rights are nothing more than private matters, or they should only be exercised in private, It's just a nonsense. It's totally contrary to the truth that human rights exist because of the communal nature of the human experience. The other mistake that people often make with this freedom of conscience or the right to freedom of conscience is this false notion that it only applies to religious ministers. So it's only, priests or pastors or nuns or people who are full-time religious ministers who have the right to freedom of conscience and have the right to say, not participate in a same-sex wedding, but other ordinary Joes who don't have that status, who are not religious ministers, they are not allowed to exercise that same freedom. Well, that's a nonsense as well. The right to freedom of conscience is not actually tied to any specific religious notion. It is genuinely about ethical decision-making. It's about right and wrong. It's about the conscience of the individual. And it's something that every human person should be free to exercise. And it's really important in a society that every human person has that right respected and is able to freely exercise that. The big mistake here that people often make is they don't understand and make the distinction about what legitimate freedom of conscience is actually all about. So, for example, in this scenario where you have a person who turns up at a cake shop and says to the business owner, I want you to bake me a wedding cake for my same-sex wedding ceremony, that is not the same thing as a gay person walking into a cake shop and being told, I'm sorry, we're not going to serve you because you're gay. So if the business owner turns around in the first scenario and says, I'm declining politely to actually bake a cake for your same-sex wedding, that is not at all the same thing as when a person who is gay turns up to a cake shop and is told, we don't serve gay people in here, you can take your business elsewhere. It would be unjust to say to a person who walked into your store as a business owner, I don't serve gay people in here, you can leave, or I don't serve people who are black, get out of my store. Those would be two very clear examples of unjust discrimination. Why? Because you are targeting a person based on their innate characteristics. You are refusing to serve a person based on their innate or their immutable characteristics, their race, their sexual orientation. And you're saying, I'm sorry, I don't serve people with that particular orientation. However, that's not the same thing that's happening when a person turns up to a business owner and says, I want you to participate in my same-sex wedding. And this is where freedom of conscience really kicks in, and this is where the difference is. Because when a person turns up to a store and says, I want you to bake me a gay wedding cake, what they are now saying to the business owner is, I want you to participate in my actions. And actions can quite often involve a moral component. And so your right to freedom of conscience is there so that you can say to someone, I'm sorry, I'm not going to participate in your action, because I don't find it agreeable to my conscience. I don't find it ethically acceptable. I have moral disagreement with you on that point of action that you are about to engage in, so I am going to decline to participate in that action. It's got nothing to do with whether you are gay or straight. It's simply, I do not accept the morality of that action, and so therefore I'm not going to participate in it. And that's a very different thing. You are not discriminating against the person based on their innate characteristics. The person is not being refused service because they are gay. Instead, what's happening is the business owner is refusing to participate in the action of a same-sex wedding. Now, that's what freedom of conscience is all about. And it's quite acceptable and it's quite important for people to be able to exercise that right. Like I said, you don't want to live in a society where your business owners and your medical professionals don't actually exercise conscience, where they have just surrendered their conscience to the state. And they rely on the state to tell them what is morally acceptable and what is not, and they just follow through based on the dictates of the state or the dictates of the majority. If that was the case, and we lived our societies that way, and we structured our societies that way, and we punished people for ever exercising freedom of conscience, then it would have taken a lot longer for slavery to have been outlawed in the West, that's for sure. Because when those people spoke up and said, no, this is morally reprehensible and we refuse to participate in this and we are speaking out against that, effectively those people in that scenario, what they're doing is they are refusing to surrender their conscience to the will of the majority. They are refusing to surrender their conscience to the state and to the dictates of the state or the dictates of the law. Because as we know, the majority, the law, the state, they can and often do make mistakes, and those mistakes can be very serious if we look at human history. Through the Nazi regime, one of the big problems of that era was that medical professionals, because a lot of evil things were done by medical professionals under that regime. And one of the big problems is they had surrendered their conscience to the regime. And afterwards, subsequently, a lot of people tried to justify their actions by saying, well, I was just following orders. In other words, I wasn't actually stopping to evaluate. There was no sort of conscientious decision-making going on here. There was no engagement of my conscience. I was just, and even people who often knew what they were doing was wrong and were able to clearly articulate that afterwards, but they had surrendered their conscience. That is not a good thing. You don't want to live in a society where people have surrendered their conscience to an outside force. That is not a good thing at all. Now, with any sort of human right like this, what that means is there are going to be messy moments around the fringes. There are going to be people who turn up with weird ideas about how they should be able to exercise freedom of conscience. But it's one of those principles that in order to protect, you have to accept that it's going to get a little bit messy around the edges. Now, sometimes in society, particularly in the West, we're not so good with that. We like things to be tightly and narrowly confined, and we don't like the uncertainty or the greyness. But around the edges of a right to freedom of conscience, you are going to have some of those messy scenarios crop up. But what you must not do is you must never, ever look at those sort of fringe extreme examples and then say, oh, right, we should destroy the principle altogether. Because it's very dangerous to live in a society where people are not able to actually exercise freedom of conscience. And on a more sort of, I guess, pragmatic perspective, the last thing you want to go to is a doctor who doesn't actually exercise their conscience. Instead, they've surrendered it to an outside authority. You want a doctor, even if you might disagree with them on issues, who actually engages their conscience, especially when they're treating you. Because there might come a time when you rely on that doctor's conscience to actually ensure that you are treated in a dignified and genuinely caring way. And the only way that happens sometimes is because the doctor is not willing to surrender their conscience to an outside force. And the last thing you want, too, is a doctor who has become nothing more than a sort of medical dispensary where you turn up and you say, well, doctor, I want this, sign the prescription now, you do what I say. You actually want a doctor who is going to take the gift of that medical knowledge that they have been bestowed with and who is going to actually put it at the service of your flourishing and who is going to engage their intellect and their conscience in the process of doing that. They're not just there to follow your orders, they are there to actually serve your good, even at times if you don't want to hear what they have to say. The last thing we want to live in, as I said, is a society where freedom of conscience has been stripped away. And again, I think this is an important right that we need to get right, because the last thing we want is to have surrendered over to the state the authority to actually tell people what they can and cannot do, and that they are never to act according to their own conscience, that the state is like God and the state will dictate to you and we will punish you if you do not do what we demand of you in these areas, particularly in these areas where there is this moral disagreement that can arise, where someone is being asked to participate in the actions of another person. As per usual, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so please let me know what you think in the comments section below. If you like the content I'm creating and you'd like to see more of it, then please support me on Patreon or PayPal. The links for both are in the description below. That's right, I can hear my theme music too. I'll see you tomorrow on The Daily Question.